Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us at Radical Anthropology and on Zoom this time only. And we're respecting the picket lines going on the UCU strikes at UCL, but we're going to carry on our class tonight with Chris Knight, who's RAG's main founder. And this is one of the kind of classic areas of research in mythology that Chris has pursued for many long years, going back to the 1980s or even earlier than that, on the mythology of Yolngu people in North-East Arnhem Land, and particularly the story of the Wawilak sisters. So this is an Australian Aboriginal sacred story, and it's one of the most interpreted stories in the whole of anthropology by many anthropology greats, from Warner, who Chris is going to draw off, Ronald Burnt, and of course, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who wrote a lot about Wawilak. So Chris, do you want to tell us about Wawilak?
Yes, well, this is the best known, most intensively studied myth, as Kim said, in all of social anthropology. And I managed to collect, 70, 80 versions before writing my book, Menstruation and the Origins of Culture. So there are many, many different versions. Some are very short. And the one we're going to be telling this evening, that I'm going to be reading out actually, is rather long. I'll start with a very short one. And I'm taking it from this amazing, lovely book, The Red Thread, by the Chilean artist, Cecilia Vicuña, because she was influenced in her work on red threads, the red quipus, which kind of made Cecilia famous. She was influenced by the fact that I brought to light the string figures made by women in North-East Arnhem Land, the Yolngu people, because the women used string to depict things which are part of their own women's secret life. And so, for example, one string figure, quite a complicated one, women called menstrual blood of three women, as if menstrual blood of three women is a kind of one of those things one might produce a string figure of. So I'm reading out from her work, because she found from my stuff, because I found it in turn, one of the very, very shortest versions of the story of the two Wawilak sisters. String was first made by the two Wawilak sisters at Madawa near Buckingham Bay. They saw a lot of honey, about which they made a string loop. Later, the elder sister made a figure of the yams in her sister's hands. She then looked inside her sister's vagina and made another string figure. They sat down, the two sisters, looking at each other with their feet out and legs apart, and both menstruated. Each one made a loop of the other one's menstrual blood, after which they put the string loops around their necks. They were swallowed by a snake. And Cecilia, I'll just show the pictures here. Cecilia got some artists to sort of reproduce the scene in her own work. These two sisters acted out here with these loops of red wool. So that's a very short version. Two sisters synchronize their menstrual flows, make a loop like a string figure of the blood, it looped round them, and they were swallowed by a snake. And you've got to sort of put two and two together. What exactly is going on? I'm going to be arguing that menstrual synchrony, synchronized menstruation, was perhaps the most intense form of female solidarity produced through ritual that the Aboriginal Australian people could conjure up. And nothing could be more intimate and close than combining your blood. And in my own view, menstrual synchrony was just part of life. It was something which women did, particularly in celebrating a young woman's first menstrual period. And if you form a loop of blood around you, with 2, 3, 4 of you, you're swallowed up. inside the blood. And in my own view, the snake, as it's called, is nothing other than that cyclicity, that connectivity, that flow of blood, producing a sense of communitas, of intense intimacy and communion. So this evening's talk is going to be kind of a follow-up on the previous talk I gave earlier this term on the worldwide mythological motif of the dragon. So people have tried to work out what does the dragon mean, because it's so familiar to us all from myths and fairy tales. And people have suggested, well, maybe it's water, because water is very important, especially in the desert regions of Australia. Maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's fertility, maybe it's sex, maybe it's a penis. I mean, all sorts of kind of maybes. Instead of going to the one place in the world where you can be pretty sure what the rainbow snake is, because the rainbow snake is clearly a snake which is like the lowest of the creatures, and at the same time the highest. It's low on the ground, and it also flies. The rainbow snake is clearly a version of the dragon, and perhaps I should stress there's no such thing as the dragon. It's not like a sort of, you know, fixed thing. It's just that mythology constantly comes up with images of opposites combined. And among these scintillating oppositions is a thing which is the highest and the lowest. So a snake with wings, it combines water with fire, another two opposites. It combines human life with animal life, because the snake is an animal, but it's got human sexual appetites. And all those opposites come together: death and life, rainy season and dry, sunshine and rain. Of course, a rainbow, which is the emblem of the rainbow snake in Australia. What is a rainbow? It's a very puzzling, shimmering thing. You can try to get near it, but it keeps getting further away. It sort of goes up into the sky, but of course it also seems to plunge into the earth at each end. And of course the rainbow is made of drops of rain, inside of which is fire, the sun's light. So, and of course the rainbows appear in between sunshine and rain. So all the sort of in between places you can think of, just think of all the opposites of which life is made, put them all together, and you got something like a winged serpent or a rainbow snake or a dragon. I'm going to read out, it's going to take a bit of time, I'm going to read out the most impressive, momentously powerful, and I don't know, somber version that exists, which was recorded by W.L. Warner, a sociologist who sort of became an anthropologist for a while in Australia. And he called his book on this subject of Aboriginal Australian totemism, because totemism means kind of a belief system in which humans and animals talk to each other and kind of, you know, combine. He called it a black civilization, in a deliberate attempt to stop people from thinking that Aboriginal Australians are kind of simple folk that make simple tools. I mean, he was wanting to show people that high art, high culture, on the level of Shakespeare, civilized, you know, cosmology was produced by the Aboriginal Australians. These are civilized people, if you like. Obviously, the word civilization can mean different things at different times and places, but that's why he called his book A Black Civilization. And I'm going to be reading out this extraordinary story, which, as I say, Warner compared to Shakespearean drama, Shakespearean perhaps tragedy. So, the myth of the Wawilak women. It was the time of Bamun, when Wonga men walked about and modern men had not yet appeared. So the time of Bamun, that's often translated as the dream time. And when Wonga men walked around, Wonga men are kind of dream time men, but I'll just read on. It was a time of Bamun when Wonga men walked about and modern men had not yet appeared. Everything was different. Animals were like men then. So the dream time, and in Southern African hunter-gatherer ethnography, it's sometimes called first creation as opposed to second creation. The dream time is a place in which there are no splits, no crevices, no boundaries. Heaven and earth combine. but life and death combine, male and female combine. Humans are animals, animals are human, life is death, death is, all the sort of distinctions that we're familiar with don't exist. We have a kind of cosmic harmony or unity. And really mythology the world over starts out with something like that assumption. And what's perhaps really important to understand is that these what we think of as magical myths and fairy tales all over the world, they're not nonsense, they're accurate descriptions of something which really happens. And what really happens among hunter-gatherers is initiation. You go through an initiation ritual. They don't bother about weddings, they don't have weddings, nobody's married to somebody else, no man's got conjugal rights in a woman, but what you do have as you come of age, as a boy or a girl, is an initiation ritual. And during initiation, you kind of go into you kind of die in order to be reborn as an adult. But during that period of darkness, kind of death, male and female, human and animal kind of do merge in much the way the myths describe. So there's something realistic about the way these myths describe an initial state of undifferentiated unity. So those two Wawilak sisters had come a long distance. They were coming from the far interior to the Arafura Sea. The Arafura Sea, of course, on the northern part of Arnhem Land in Australia. They had come from the far interior Kardao country. This is a clan territory of the Dua moiety, which means that I now have to explain that in this part of Australia, it's like people do have territory, but it's nothing remotely like an Englishman's home is his castle. It's nothing like a territory with a fence around it. So across this part of Australia, the landscape is almost like a chessboard. Think of a chessboard, black squares, white squares, black squares, white squares, and you're black. You can move around in your territory, which means any black square is your square. But if you're a white piece on the chessboard, you can only move on white pieces. So in North-East Arnhem Land, you have Dua and Eurytia. So all territories, these halves or moieties, as they're called, inherited through the male line. And if you come from the Dua moiety, the Dua sort of clan, if you imagine a clan system where you've just got two clans, your territory is wherever the portion of land you're on is Dua. But it's not one place. You've got Dua here, you can step very carefully and make sure you don't go on Eurytia, which is the other one. And Dua in this part of the world is symbolized with the color red, particularly dark red, blood red ochre. With Eurytia is colored light, sort of yellowish. But both, you have two kinds of ochre, pale yellow ochre or dark red ochre. And what's been made very clear here is that the two sisters belong to Dua, and Dua is regarded in this part of the world as ancestral. The Dua is the lineage which is the most conservative and the most linked with ritual power, and Eurytia is kind of the opposite. It's almost as if Eurytia is light, perhaps full moon, and Dua is dark, perhaps new moon, where the blood flows, something like that. So they had come from the far interior Kardao country, these two women, and there's only two women at the moment, and they make sure they only step on their own territory, which is this Dua territory. So this is a clan territory, the Dua moiety. Moiety is the same word as the French moitié, it just means a half. So imagine you've got two families everywhere, and you're either one or the other. They had come from the land of the Wawilak people, for Kardao is their country. The Wilkul, now the women have just put it sort of two categories. You either have a young woman who hasn't had any children, or an older woman who has had a child. So the young woman, the one who has not had a child, she was pregnant. The Gungmun, a woman who has had a child, literally the giver, carried her own baby under her arm in a paperbark cradle. It was a male. So we have these two sisters, one carrying a very young child and one pregnant. The two women carried stone spears and hawksdown and bush cotton. Now, any Aboriginal listener to that would be kind of shocked, especially if you're not, if you're perhaps a child not used to this. What? You've got women carrying stone spears. Well, that means women are like men, and they were covered in hawksdown and bush cotton. Well, these days, to be covered in hawksdown and bush cotton, you've got to be an initiated man. And in this part of the world, mostly men are pretty ritually dominant over women. So these women are occupying that male, very potent role, carrying stone spears and wearing the kind of costume, the kind of skin covering, decorations that only men these days are permitted to wear. So as hunters, they killed iguana, opossum, and bandicoot for their food. They also gathered some bush yams. When they killed the animals, they gave them the names they bear today. They did the same for the yam. So these two sisters are clearly kind of goddesses, because they're giving language, they're giving name, they're inventing language by giving names to things. So they kill an animal, and as the stone-tipped spear kills the animal acquires its name. They gathered all the plants and animals that are in the Merngen country today. The Merngen is the sort of traditional name, older name really, for what you now term the Yolngu country. But I'm reading from a myth recorded in the 30s. And perhaps I should mention another point, which I didn't mention at the beginning. The ethnographer makes clear that you wouldn't normally just hear a story like this. You wouldn't hear the whole story told from beginning to end. He makes a comparison with, say, in the Middle Ages in Europe. Nobody would just tell you the story about Jesus. You pick up the story from all the christenings, all the harvest festivals, all the weddings, all the funerals, and almost everything you did in life would be bound up with the story of Jesus and his death and his resurrection. And you'd gradually piece together the whole story through your ritual engagement in the different components of Christian religious practice. So this story, the ethnographer pieced together after having experienced countless different ritual incidents. But as I say, you wouldn't just hear it from beginning to end. So they gathered all the plants and animals that are in the Merngen country today. They said to each thing they killed or gathered, "You will be marain by and by." Now, what that means is that as the sisters killed an animal, this word marain, it means a divine creature or a sacred creature, a creature with sacredness attached or divinity attached. So can you sort of see what's happening? You kill the kangaroo and make a prophecy. You, as I'm killing you, know that you will soon be sacred. And you will see how that prophecy comes true as the myth proceeds. When the two sisters started their journey, they took Jaun, later Rheinbango, and still later Jinba. Then they took Wawilak, and finally Laomia. They named the country as they went along. So again, in this part of the world, you have to marry somebody who doesn't speak your own language. And the whole sort of chessboard of black and white squares are little tribal territories. Each one speaks a different dialect, sometimes very different, really not just a different dialect, but a different language. But the critical point is these sisters transgress those boundaries. They're not interested in boundaries. They're not, they move, of course, only on Dua territory. But as they do so, they're the first people to speak Jaun, a language, then Rheinbango, then Jinba, then Wawilak, then Laomia. They're the first people to speak the language of these different territories. And the rule is, when you get married, you mustn't marry somebody of your own language. You must have a husband or a wife who speaks a different language. Otherwise, it's kind of incest. So they named the country as they went along. In the Wawilak country, they copulated with Wawilak Wonga men. These men were Dua, and they were Dua. This was very wrong. So, as with Egyptian royalty and so many other royal families, these people have extraordinary power. and they seem to be entitled to have sex with their brothers, because if they copulated in the Wawilak country with Wawilak men, instead of looking for men who spoke a different language, that was incest. But of course, to be able to practice incest is a sign of exceptional potency, and in some ways actually divinity, because we'll find out that the rainbow snake never does anything except incest. Have you ever heard of a dragon that gets married, goes through a wedding? I don't think so. Dragons are very fond of young maidens, but weddings, no, that's not going to happen. So the two women stopped to rest, for the younger felt that the child she was carrying moved inside her. She knew her baby would soon be born. Yepa, that means sister. Sister, I feel near my heart, this baby is turning, she said. The older one said, then let us rest. They sat down, and the older sister put her hand on the abdomen of the younger sister and felt the child moving inside. She then massaged her younger sister, for she knew her labor pains had commenced. The baby was born there. Now that's a picture of intense intimacy between two sisters. And rather like the women having stone-tipped spears, and rather like the mention that they practice incest, it's the men today in that area actually have an ideal situation. What should happen when a woman gives birth to a baby? Well, the male ideal is nothing. She should just hardly mention it. She should just go out into the bush and come back with the baby. There should be no celebration. She shouldn't take any woman with her, certainly not her mother. And there should be no ceremonial around childbirth. But of course, in this story is exactly the opposite. The sisters are being very intimate with each other, helping each other. And anyone hearing this story will be moved by this description of intimacy between these two women, which kind of goes against, at least I don't say always against practice, but certainly against a male patriarchal ideal that ideally women shouldn't make a fuss about female things like menstruation or childbirth. Those ceremonial practices belong to men. The baby was born there. It was Eurytia, for its mother was Dua. So it couldn't really help the idea that if you have a male lineage system, you get your Dua or Eurytia from your father. Well, obviously then from your mother, you're going to have to crisscross from one to the other. So when a woman has a baby, her baby is not going to be in the same moiety, it's going to be the opposite one. So if you're Dua as a woman, your child will be Eurytia. The country was still part of the territory of the Wawilak clan. After the child was born, the older sister gathered more bush food, and then the two moved on toward the sea. They stopped at various places and gave all of them their names. They named all the clan territories and the localities within their borders. They first rested at Jiri Jiri, Quail Place. These are the totemic sites, and as often as not, these sites are the sites where a particular species, a particular quail or a crow or a fish or oyster is likely to be abundant at certain seasons of the year. So they rested at the Quail Place, Crow Place, Fish Spear Place, White Oyster Place, and then Katatanga, Falling Meteor Place. It's interesting how with these systems of totemism, there are other animals, less frequently plants, but actually quite frequently constellations. Constellations kind of count as species of animal in systems of totemism around the world. I'm not saying it's a constellation; it's a falling meteor, but it's kind of cosmic, and it could still be the name for a totemic area. All these localities were Dua and were within the country of the Wawilak clan. Although the Wawilak sisters went to almost all the clans of the Dua moiety, they never walked on the country of the Eurytia moiety. So you can see how they had to sort of carefully step. You know, imagine you're on this chessboard. There's a huge chessboard. It's a real landscape of chessboard, and you've got to carefully make sure that even when you can't help go quite near the sort of oppositional, territory, Eurytia, if you're Dua, you have to sort of step over it and take really they take huge care, if you like, to be incestuous, not to engage in marriage, not to mix with a kind of territory in which you might find a marriage partner. They're going to, if you, a good way of putting it is to say, these two sisters will always stay with their own blood. Come on, sister, said the older, we'll go quickly now. They drank water at the last place and hurried on. They did not stop until they sat down at the great Miramina waterhole in the country of the Liaumea clan. Now, the Miramina means rock python's back. And we're going to find out in a moment that this great rock python is the dragon. It is in the bottom of this well, in the deep subterranean waters, below the upper waters, that Yolngu, the great copper snake, the python totem of the Dua moiety, lives. So they arrived at the place in which dwells the dragon. And of course, anyone who knows about dragons would know that what they do, among other things, is guard the sacred waters. You can't reach the water without kind of appeasing, paying respect, paying homage to the guardian of the water, which will be the dragon. They call the country for the first time Miramina. So they gave this particular country within which we have this waterhole, Miramina, meaning rock python's back. The older sister took a fire drill and made a fire. She started cooking all the yams and other bush food that she had gathered and all the animals that they had killed on their journey. Sister, you cook my food for me too, said the younger one. Be patient, said the older one. Then she gathered some paper bark and fashioned a bed for her younger sister's newborn child. As she did this, she said, by and by, sister, we must circumcise these two small sons of ours. Yes, sister, said the younger. So they're clearly the originators of modern male initiation involving circumcision. But what we've been told is that they're cooking food, or rather they're trying to cook food, because we're going to see in a second that it kind of doesn't work. And there's a very profound reason why it doesn't work. As soon as they cooked the food, each animal and plant jumped out of the fire and ran to the Miramina waterhole and jumped into it. They all went into this Jungu and Gunabibi well. Jungu and Gunabibi are the great initiation ceremonies involving this waterhole. The crab ran in first. When he did this, the two women talked Lialaumia for the first time. Before this, they talked Wawilak. So you have to have a sort of image of, they're trying to cook the crab. There's a nice fire going, they put the crab on it, and instead of cooking, it goes in the reverse direction. I mean, if you're cooking an animal, it should go from live to dead to cooked. And instead, this animal is dead, but it goes backwards into life, and so life that it runs into the waterhole and changes language, or rather triggers a switch of language from Liaumia to Wawilak on the part of the sisters. So it's all those things are connected together, the raw and the cooked, no language and language, wet and dry. For the myth makers, there's something in common between all these radical transitions between one state and its opposite. The other plants and animals followed the crab. The yams ran like men, as did the iguanas, frilled-necked lizard, darpool, ovaku snake, rock pythons, seagulls, native companions, and crocodiles. Each ran and dived into the clan's totemic well and disappeared from sight. Okay, they come from being dead animals to being live animals, and as they go to the water, prompting a completely new language, they become not only live animals, but people. They're walking on two legs. So clearly, they're not the kind of thing you're going to cook and eat. It's all pretty scary. The older woman went out to gather bark to make a bed. I mean, they've given up on the cooking. They're going to have to be hungry. The older woman went out to gather bark to make a bed for her sister's baby after it was born. She walked over some of the water of the Miramina well. Her menstrual blood fell in the totem well, and was carried down the sacred clan waterhole where Yolngu lives. Now, in the tourist versions of the Two Sisters story, you won't find that detail. It's a very, very, I would say, especially for Western academics, but also perhaps Western theologians and people generally, you don't really want to talk about things like this. In the story, it's the critical thing. The older sister is looking to gather bark, kind of forgetting that she's menstruating, and she allows her blood to fall into the well where the rainbow snake dwells. When the menstrual blood dropped into the pool, Yolngu smelled the odor of this pollution from where he was lying in the black water beneath the floor of the totem well. His head was lying quietly on the bottom of the pit. He raised his head and smelled again and again. "Where does this blood come from?" he said. He opened the bottom of the well by throwing the stone which covered its base out of the well onto the land by the women's camp. This stone is near the camp today and can still be seen by those who go there. It's now a snake's head. So one of the things about these stories, they're always attached to the landscape. And the reason you know that these stories are true is because all around you is the evidence. Here is the head of the snake. Here are the crabs which try to escape from the fire. The whole landscape is like the mythology in stone and trees and sand and rivers mapped out for you. So, and of course, you don't even tell the stories really without kind of going to the right places in the course of your different rituals. And sometimes, as we know, the song lines connect up different areas so that you tell different parts of the story at different times, having arrived at different places. And the places you're at are mnemonic. They'll remind you the things which happened at particular places, just demonstrating the evident truth of the story. How else did this great rock get there? In this case, Yolngu crawled out slowly, like a snake does, from the well. When he came out, he sucked some of the well water into his mouth. He spat it into the sky. Soon, a cloud about the size of a man's hand appeared from nowhere in the center of the sky. As Yolngu slowly rose from out of the bottom of the pool, the totemic well water rose too and flooded the earth. One of the things I discovered when I first discovered this myth, because I already knew a little bit about, being brought up a Roman Catholic, I knew a little bit about the Bible, and I knew about Noah's Ark, and I knew about the Tower of Babel, and I knew about Jonah and the whale. So I knew about these fragments of biblical mythology. But of course, in the Bible, they're not too well connected. One thing happens and another thing happens, and you're not quite sure how they really add up. So it is rather wonderful to find a story which is kind of the real version, where all the different elements are part of one story and make sense. So here we have, in the story of the two Wawilak sisters, precisely the story of Noah and the flood. And we'll see why in a moment, because just as in the story of Noah and the flood, there's a great flood which covers the entire earth. We also know that within that flood, in the biblical version, we have the animals 2 by 2. 2 by 2 means fertile, so Noah and his wife and all the different animals. So somehow within this flood, everything dies, and yet immortality is preserved. The future is preserved inside the flood. And of course, you can't really have a concept of a flood without thinking of the things which cause floods. And we know that tides are floods. And we know that when you have great floods from the sea, they tend to occur at high tide most of all. And of course, we also know that the tides result from the pull of the moon. And we also know, of course, don't we, that the moon is also linked all over the world with the moon inside you, inside every woman, as part of a cycle. And so this flood is a flood of water, but of course, remember that the water is streaked with blood. And that blood is menstrual blood. and we're going to find other elements of the biblical story kind of anticipated, actually, in this story, which is clearly, in its different versions, of course. I mean, the stories vary and they keep changing, but they change within very strict limits. There's always something richly preserved in the different variations, as of course Levi-Strauss himself, the great anthropologist who made the study of mythology into a science for the first time. You have variations on a theme, but there's something constant. Rather, the way I look at it is, think of a kaleidoscope. You can turn the kaleidoscope, and the little crystals of different colors, they change their shape, but there's only so many pieces inside that kaleidoscope. There's only so many patterns can be made, quite a lot of patterns actually. But if you've only got 3 colors and you've only got squares and diamonds, there's a kind of limit to the range of variability. So this is the flood myth. An anthropologist, Alan Dundas, wrote a whole book about the flood myth, and the flood myth is it's all over the world. And maybe it's the time to say here, I might as well say it now as any other time. Of course, there was a huge flood, an absolutely worldwide flood. We're actually approaching another huge flood caused, of course, by melting of the glaciers. I mean, most of our cities are unfortunately going to get drowned. London certainly. But what happened before, when there was a huge melting of the glaciers, was at the end of the last ice age, and sea levels rose everywhere. And in Australia, of course, Greater Australia, which connected up Indonesia, Borneo, and places with what we now think of as Australia, became separated into two huge parts. So the flood was a real event, but in mythology, floods are always linked to the moon. And again, because of the moon inside women, which is also another flood in mythology, you'll find that connection here, which is very explicit in this story. I mean, most stories, it's all very, I don't know, it's kind of hidden and you've got to work it all out. This story makes things beautifully clear. So as Yolngu slowly rose from out of the bottom of the pool, the totemic well water rose too and flooded the earth. He pulled himself up on the stone which he had thrown and laid his head there. He looked around him. He saw the women and their babies. Yolngu was older brother to these women, and they were sisters to him. Their children were his wakus, and he was Gawel to them. So again, this is interesting. The snake, Yolngu, he's the older brother to the women. So we kind of knew he was the same blood, because Dua, wherever they go, Dua, and of course we know that the snake is Dua, so it must be kind of the same blood, but he's actually quite closely related to the sisters. He's their elder brother. And in kinship traditions, your elder brother is your custodian. And wherever you have a matrilocal residence system, or a bias toward matrilocal residence, and therefore a bias toward matrilineal descent, a man's children will be his sister's children, and he will be the custodian, the guardian of his sister and his sister's children. So it's getting very paradoxical. This Yolngu is the women's own blood, and he's their brother, but in this case, he's their elder brother. So he must be their guardian in some sense. And yet, of course, the story is just filled with contradictions. Yolngu continued to look at them. He hissed. This was to call out for rain. There was no cloud in the sky until then, but soon the two sisters saw a very small, black cloud appear in the heavens. They did not see the great python lying there, watching them. The cloud grew larger and larger, and soon the rain came down. So the snake rises up out of the water, causes this flood. The flood subsides sufficiently for him to see the two sisters. He then spits the water up into the air, and it causes a little black cloud. And this cloud seems to be attracted to the two sisters. The Wawilak sisters hurriedly built a house to be ready for the rain. They named the forked sticks they used as uprights. The women went inside the house. Now, this house plays a significant role in the ritual reenactments of the myth. You have a house. Maybe the house isn't quite the right word, because it's a menstrual hut, but quite a large one, within which women's secret activities, such as menstruation and childbirth, take place. And it's really important that every single part of that house, that hut, kind of has a name, because each part is sacred and needs to be replicated in ritual to this day. The women went inside the house. They did not know where this rain had come from. They did not know that the older sister's menstrual blood had defiled the Miramina waterhole and had made Yolngu angry. The Wawilak women went to sleep, but the rain poured down harder and harder and awakened them. The Gungman said, "Sister," that's the older sister, "where does this rain come from? There's no cloud in the north or south, and there's no cloud in the east or west, but over us is this huge black cloud. I think something is wrong. I think something terrible is going to happen." So this cloud is just kind of moving across the sky until it's right over, with all its pouring rain producing a flood, right over those two sisters. She got up and went inside, the elder sister, that is. The younger one stayed within the house and sang. The Gungman beat the ground with her yam stick. She knew now that Yolngu was going to swallow her, and she wanted to stop the rain. She sang, "Yolngu, don't you come out and swallow us. We are good and we are clean." While she sang, she danced around the house. The two sisters then called out the taboo names of the Miramina well. While the older sister sang and danced around the house, and the younger sister sang inside it to stop the rain from coming down and to drive the great cloud away, they were being surrounded by all the snakes in the land: the pythons, death adders, tree snakes, black snakes, tiger snake, iguanas, the blue-tongued lizard, snails, caterpillars, and all the dua snakes came up around them in a circle, for they'd all heard the call of their father, Yolngu. It was night and the women did not see them. So we're told that the sisters are trying to stop the rain, but as they sing and dance to stop the rain, their activities seem to be having exactly the opposite effect. It's not only brings on the rain and arouses Yolngu, but all around, all the other snakes from all the different islands in that part of the world, a whole coast of islands and inlets, all each one with its kind of its own snake, they all begin to gather around. The Gungman first sang all the songs now sung in the general camp. Now, the general camp would mean when the Aborigines here settle for a period, you have a kind of series of concentric circles. In the center it's only the most elderly initiated men perhaps who've been initiated several times and are on the way to the final initiation, which is when you actually move into the land of the dead. When you die, that's the sort of final revelation of all the secrets. You can look forward to death in that sense. But then outside is an area where you might just get young men who have been initiated, but they're not really in on all the innermost secrets. And I'm kind of using patriarchal language here because it is the language used. Outside that are the rubbish people. And the rubbish people, of course, women and children. And Europeans who turn up and anthropologists. I mean, they're rubbish people because they're not initiated into the secrets. So what the Gungman, this older sister, is doing, she's trying to stop the rain, and she sings some songs. And she starts out with songs which rubbish people can understand, just ordinary songs that everyone knows. No, that doesn't seem to stop the rain. So she now goes further into the inner circle and sings songs which only initiated men know. Okay, it seems to be working a little bit longer, but no. This actually seems to be bringing on the rain. So I'll just read this out again. The Gungman first sang all the songs now sung in the general camp. After this, she sang all the songs sung in the general camp during the Gunabibi. That's one of the great initiation rituals. These are the less powerful songs. She did this first, for she thought they would stop the rain. But it did not stop. She was afraid of this rain, for it came out of a cloud she could not understand, because this cloud had come from nowhere. She sang then the taboo songs of the Junguan. That's a more important male initiation ritual. Kak, yay. She sang the songs where the subsection names are called out in the Junguan. She took the Dua subsections first. So right across Australia, you have this system of sections and subsections alongside, kind of in some ways connected, of course, to the Dura versus Eritrea moiety system. And what it means is that wherever you go in Australia on walkabout, you take your whole arrive 500 miles, 1,000 miles away, with people speaking completely different language. And as long as you're respectful and ask the elders who meet you, permission to move in, they'll say, well, what's your totem? What's your, and you might say emu. Ah, emu, right, your flesh is emu. Right, those there, over there, those women are your wives. You can have sex with all of them, in principle. Of course, things are going to be arranged and maybe the women have got to agree to it, but I mean, in principle, you're kind of already married to these women. Over there, those are your mothers-in-law. Be really careful of those. You don't want to meet up with those. They're kind of, I would say, dragons. Those are the mothers-in-law. They're really ferociously dangerous people. These are your children. These are your nephews. These are your uncles. These are your fathers. You've got categories of kinship, but the categories stretch across the landscape, which is pretty amazing because it means you're always at home. But what's happening in this part of the story is that these categories, this what are called subsection categories, all your fathers over here, your sisters over here, your mothers and mother, the names of them are being called out, and in being called out, they're being established. It's through ritual that you establish these, what some philosophers these days call institutional facts, facts which you can't see by measurement or smell or touch. They're facts which are made into facts through collective agreement, in this case through ritual action. The young sister sang like the leader of the Junguan ceremony does today. Now, again, this is so important. Today, the leader of the Junguan ceremony, which is a male initiation ritual, it just stands to reason. Well, clearly, it's going to be a male. But men didn't invent any of this. In the story, the young sister was the leader of the Junguan and sang out these critical sounds of the subsection systems herself. She kept time with the singing sticks. She said, we'll turn to the Eritrea subsections now, we'll call out the Eritrea people. So they do, because they have to invent everything, they have to invent Eritrea, even though they are not themselves willing to touch Eritrea, but they still have to invent the opposite category. They sang the Gama songs first, for they are not strong and belong to the camp of the women. Then they sang the songs of the Mandiela, for it's only a little more powerful and its songs only slightly more taboo. Then they sang Junguan and Ulmark. Those are the really, really potent, secret, sacred songs. The rain continued and came down harder and harder. They decided that they must sing something even more powerful, more taboo, deeper within the ceremonial camp of the men. They sang Yolngu and menstrual blood. They put rainbow stake and menstrual blood together. Well, now they're really for it. When Yolngu heard these words, he crawled into the camp of the two women and their two children. He had suddenly fallen into a deep sleep from his magic. He licked the women and children all over, preparatory to swallowing them. He bit the noses of each and made the blood come. He swallowed the old woman first, the Wilkel next, and the little boys last. So you'll notice the rainbow snake can only swallow people who are covered in blood. And if he thinks he hasn't got enough blood, well, okay, we'll bite their noses. But whatever happens, they've got to be slippery with blood, and then they can be swallowed alive. And they are swallowed alive. There's nothing about them being killed first. They've got to bleed first, but that's different. He waited for daylight. When dawn came, he uncoiled and went out a short distance in the bush because he was too near the water. He wanted to leave the women in a dry place. Now, notice this alternation. We've had alternation between kind of human and animal, male and female, all these things. And now the wet and the dry. You can only be swallowed up in the wet. And in fact, the rainbow snake, the great snake, needs the water. But supposing he wants not to do the opposite of swallowing, he wants to eject, regurgitate the sisters. Well, he's got to find a dry place to do that. So the water's got to go up and down, or at least you've got to find areas. And you remember the story of Noah's Ark and the flood, Mount Ararat. At the end of as the floods are subsiding, Noah and his wife and all the animals have got to get out on one of the few mountains higher than the level of the flood. So he wanted to leave the women in a dry place. And we'll come to that motif in a moment. He raised himself and stood very straight. He was like the trunk of a very tall, straight tree. His head reached as high as a cloud. Because the snake goes vertical right up into the sky, that's why some anthropologists, maybe some other people as well, Westerners, Europeans, just trying to make head or tail of this. I've read about all this, by the way. I mean, I've read, it's pretty obvious that the rainbow snake has a penis. I mean, it's erect. It's like a tree. It goes right up to the sky, and it's definitely to do with sex. So, I mean, it's a no-brainer. It's a penis. The point is that when you look at the Aboriginal rainbow snake imagery in bark paintings and rock art and stuff, it's the strangest of penises because it goes round and round and round and round and round in circles. There's always concentric circles. And I don't know about you, but I don't think of a penis going round and round in circles as a natural thing for a penis to do. So it's much more likely to be a womb, which is, of course, goes round in circles kind of thing. But it's probably better to think of it as a womb, which is also a penis, because as I mentioned before, the dragon is as a snake, the lowest, it's the bat or flying fox or eagle or bird, the highest, it's everything in opposite. So combining these two things, combining penis with vagina would make a lot of sense. But it's the idea that it's just a penis is obviously a bit partial. So when he raised himself to the sky, the floodwaters came up as he did. They flooded and covered the entire earth. No tree or hill showed above them. As I say, this is a flood myth. When he fell later, the water receded, and at the same time, there was dry ground. While he was high in the sky and had the two women and children inside him, he sang all the Mandela, Yolngu and Gunabibi, and Ulmark ceremonies. Actually, in many of the other versions that I've looked at, but obviously the anthropologists have collected a time when this was a living myth, part of rich, what happens is that the snake goes right up to the sky, and you can hear from inside the snake the sound of thunder, but these sounds speak a kind of language, or rather that it's a kind of singing, a thunderous chorus of song. And the songs are the songs of the Mandela, the Yolngu, and the Gunabibi, and the Ulmark. In other words, all the songs that men need to sing to go through their initiation rituals, these sisters were singing from inside the snake, which is telling you that being inside that snake is quite a powerful position. I mean, you're still singing. Am I back? Am I back? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
You must have offended. You must have offended Yolngu somehow.
That was terrifying. Right. So now, okay. So you're hearing these sounds, which today only men can sing, and they're the most deeply secret songs of the men being sung by the women when they're inside the snake. Now, don't forget, we've got lots of different snakes now. The other Wongar Wurtits, totemic pythons, they all stood up too. They were all Dua, as Yolngu was Dua, and Nun was Eurytia. Yolngu was higher than all the rest. He was the leader for those other snakes and more powerful than they. The Western Island python, Parango clan, raised himself. What's your language? He said. I am Lialaumir. What's yours? I'm Parango, you're Yolngu. What's yours? Yolngu then said to the python on the Howard Island mainland. I'm Liagaumir. What is yours? He asked the Banyan Island python. I am Kamalanga language. My country is Kolpayunula. The Mandalpui, Wawilak, Boon, Jin, Kalpu, Marangu, Japu, Duarak, and all the Dua clans were asked by Yolngu what their language was, and each answered the language of his country. The Miramina snake said then, I see we all talk different languages. it would be better if we all talk the same tongue. Now, I see in that story, part of the story, something like the Tower of Babel myth, because we all know that everyone spoke the same language until we kind of rose up to the sky. Humans rose up to the sky and tried to. And this particular god, this patriarchal god, Jehovah, wasn't too keen on egalitarianism, wasn't too keen on being as equal, and cast them all down by confounding their tongues, by making them all speak different languages. And as a result of that, the Tower of Babel was never finished. And we've been stuck on this earth ever since, whereas had we been allowed to all speak the same language, we might have got to heaven. There's something similar, isn't there? You can just see a sort of an echo or resonance or anticipation of that whole idea of going up and down, speaking the same language, because when you're up in the sky, speaking the voice of thunder inside the snake, everyone's speaking the same tongue. And it's the voice of the thunder itself. And of course, the thunder has a voice of fire as well, because you don't just emit thunder, you spit out fire. Not cooking fire, of course. This is celestial fire. This is not the kind of fire that you can control. It's like God's fire, divine fire. Okay, now this great snake, Yolngu, says, I see we all talk different languages. It would be better if we talk the same tongue. We can't help this now. It's better then that we all have our ceremonies together, for we do own the same moraine, the same totemic emblems. So they've got something in common, which is their rituals, which as they come together, they all perform as a collective. They all sang out together then, and their voices were the thunder and roared all over the land and sea. So the way to speak a common language is to speak in thunder. And in this case, of course, the thunder is caused by combinations of menstrual blood. So the blood has a color, and it's awesome and dangerous. It's the color of blood, but you can also hear the blood. And you hear the blood in the sound of thunder, and across Australia, you could produce the sound of thunder with a bull roarer. You whirl it around your head to make it really potent. You make sure that your sister's menstrual blood is smeared along a string. Get 20, 30, 40 of you. You're all whirling these bull roarers. You go woo, 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 like a thunderous sound. And each one of us remembers that sound, because we were in the mother's womb at one point, and what we heard was woo, 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 the heartbeat of our mother, the pulse of our mother, the great mother, who of course is none other than the rainbow snake, who takes you back into a womb in order to regurgitate you so that you die, but you don't stay dead. You do what the moon does, become alive again. That's the experience of initiation. They all sang out together then, and their voices were the thunder and roared all over the land and sea. The python wongas still stood on their tails, high up in the sky. The great Yolngu turned to a Daidua snake. He said, what have you been eating? I've been eating freshwater fish, Dua variety. How did he taste? Oh, he was very good, nice and fat. What are you going to do now that you have eaten him? I'm going to spear him up and look at him, and then I'm going to eat him again for the last time. He was going to do what the live pythons do now. They eat something, they swallow it, they spear it up, they lick it, and they eat it again. It does not come up again. Yolngu now asked the Japu python what he had eaten. I ate a wallaby, Dua moiety. I'm going to let him out. He inquired of the others. The Maranga snake had eaten a small plains bird, the Kalpu a sand crab, Girin a green sea turtle, Naladi a small shellfish, Wawilak a bird, Mantelpui a freshwater fish, Kamalanga honey. All of the snakes of the Dua clan were asked. Western Island snake was asked last. He is second highest and only lower in rank than Miramina snake. What have you been eating? The Lialamia snake asked the Western Island one. I won't tell you. Come on, tell me. I've heard lightning and thunder and wind in your country. Something has happened there. You give me something and I'll tell you. Come on, you and I are brothers. Remember, I call you brother. If I tell you, you must tell me, because I call you Wawa, older brother, and you call me Yuki, younger brother, just as you said. I'll tell you. I've eaten parrotfish. What color? Blue. What kind of teeth? White. What you have eaten is no good. Why didn't you eat iguana or stone kangaroo? But what did you eat? Replied the Western Island snake. I won't tell you. Why not? The Miramina snake raised itself higher and higher into the sky. He laid his neck and head on a cloud. His eyes shot lightning. He felt ashamed. Come on, tell me, my big brother, said the Wessel Island snake again. The Wessel Island snake continued to insist, and his head came closer and closer as his body writhed across the clouds toward the Miramina python. He was very angry. After a long time, Yolngu said, I ate 2 sisters and a small boy and girl. When he said this, the southeastern monsoon started blowing from off the land. As it did this, the head of the Wessel Island snake hurriedly pulled back to its own well. The wind had stopped him from coming further. He wanted to make a waterway from Wessel Island to Miramina. When you see that landscape, it's all crisscrossed with rivers and there are meandering streams, inlets, rivers, which are, according to mythology, are the places where rainbow snakes fell. So the snakes crash down from the heavens, smash into the earth, and they've still got their windy shape that the snake had. So in these rivers are evidence of the reality of these different snakes. So that's why he wanted to make a waterway from Wessel Island to Miramina. Yolngu roared and fell to the ground at the same time. When he fell, he split the ground open and made the present dance ground at the Lialaumia ceremonial place. So these ceremonial dance grounds are linked to wells. It might not be a real well, but you kind of go down into this depression in the ground caused by the snake having crashed from sky to earth and split the ground open. And it's inside those cavities in the earth that all the really secret elements, the secret parts of the rituals occur. He lay down on the ground and thought, those 2 sisters and their children are dead inside me now. Yolngu started cleansing his mouth with his cheeks and tongue. He spat several times. He said to his sons, I'm going to spew. He regurgitated the 2 women and the little boys. They were dropped onto an ant's nest. So in that part of Australia, you have waterholes, which of course are wet and go down into the ground. And then you have like reverse image of waterholes, which are up out of the ground. And instead of being wet, they're dry. And not only dry, they're full of meat ants. And if you go inside these ants' nests, you get crumbled earth, which is used for cooking. And in fact, even if you don't cook, the ants will sort of cook you because they bite. So I'm just saying, when the snake's swallowing women, it needs a waterhole. When it's regurgitating them, the dry space it needs is like the opposite of the raw. It's the cooked, and that takes the form of these ant nests. The Wessel Island snake, when he heard what Yolngu had just said, was disgusted. You've eaten your own wakus and yeppers, he said, which means the great brother had eaten his sisters and sisters' children. The Wanga Yolngu crawled slowly back to his waterhole. He went inside but kept his head up to watch. At this time, the Yolngu totemic trumpet came out of the well and lay beside him. No one brought it and no one blew it, but it sang out like it does now. So today, to make a kind of loud, thunderous noise, one of the ways is to blow this trumpet. But in the old times, you didn't have to make an effort. It just came out of the well and blew itself. The Yolngu trumpet blew over the 2 women and their 2 sons. They were lying there like they had fainted. Some green ants came out and then bit the women and children, and they jumped. So this is the sort of another part, of course, of biblical mythology, which is death is followed by resurrection. I mean, they jumped, but that clearly they came alive. The trumpet continued to walk around while the Wanga Yolngu looked on. The women and children were alive again, and he had thought them dead. He picked up 2 singing sticks and crawled out of the waterhole. Before he emerged, he called all his sons who were in the well and put these snakes, lizards, and snails on his head and neck. So he comes out as a kind of leviathan. When the snake comes out of the well, he's covered in all the snakes, lizards, and snails. So he's a multi-species creature. He hit the mothers and their babies on their heads with the sticks and swallowed them again. He meant to keep them down this time. He felt sick again, for once more he had swallowed your people. So it's kind of, he's eating his own blood. It's incest. He's swallowed his own blood, eaten his own flesh and blood. And this is kind of wrong. It's wrong, but although it's wrong, it's like important to be wrong if you're a dragon. It's wrong, but extremely powerful. He decided to stand straight up. When he raised up, the mandelboy snake shouted, "What did you eat?" "Bandicoot," he lied. "You do not tell the truth." 2 Dua women and 2 boys, Yiritia boys. When he said this, he fell again. This time he made the Gunabibi and Ulmark dance grounds by his fall. After his fall, he crawled into the Laumia well and went down into the subterranean waters. He put a stone over his entrance and stopped the flood of water that had been coming out. He swam in the underground waters to the Wawilak country, for he wanted to take the mothers and the children back to their own country. Here, he spat them out for the last time. He left them there and came back to his own country. The 2 women turned to stone, and you can still see them in the Wawilak country today. Yolngu kept the boys inside him, for they were Yiritia and he was Dua. So because the boys weren't his own moiety, he was allowed to eat them and keep them in. But the sisters, that's incest, so he felt sick and regurgitated them. And you know the story is true because they're still there. You can actually see the 2 sisters. The 2 women did not circumcise their 2 sons as they intended because Yolngu had interfered before they were ready. It was because they so intended and said for other people to perform this act that people cut their sons today. And now the last part of the story won't be long now, but this is perhaps the most important part of it. And it kind of gets left out again from the touristy versions and so many other versions. While all this great drama was being acted out in the country of the Lialomia, 2 Wawilak Wonga men, and we haven't heard of Wonga men before, but here they are, had heard the terrible noise of the snake's voice, the thunder. They had seen the skies filled with lightning and felt the downpour of the rain. They knew something was the matter, so they followed the 2 women's tracks. It took them many days and nights to get there. They finally saw the snake tracks. "I think the sisters had trouble," said one. "I think that maybe a crocodile or python has killed them." They arrived at Miramina. They had followed the Goida River down. They saw all the ants walking around everywhere, like they smelled something that was dead and they wanted to eat. They then found all the snake tracks. The well water shone like a rainbow. When they saw this, they knew there was a snake in there. They went farther in the bush and saw the ceremonial ground where Yolngu's fall had made the dance places. "Wonga python has been here," they said. When they looked carefully at the stone, they found blood from the heads of the 2 women and boys. "What will we do?" "Run and get some paper bark and make a basket," said the older Wawilak man. They gathered 2 baskets of blood and went to the dance grounds. They made a bush house on part of the ground that represents the snake's tail. "You take all the hooks, feathers, bush cotton, and this blood, and we'll paint ourselves. You do this, and I shall go cut a hollow log and make a Yolngu trumpet." Each did his task. The hollow ridge pole from the Wawilak sister's house was used for the trumpet totemic emblem of Yolngu. The sun went down. They left the blood till morning. They slept. And while they were in a deep sleep, they dreamed of what the 2 women sang and danced when they were trying to keep Yolngu from swallowing them. The Wawilak women came back as spirits and taught the 2 men the Junguan songs and dances that are for the outside general camp and the inside ones that are for the men's camp. The sisters told the men the way to do the Mandela, Gunabibi, and Ulmark ceremonies. They sang Yolngu and Muit. The men slept on and dreamed that Yolngu brought out all the iguanas from the Miramina well. The 2 sisters said, "This is all now. We are giving you this dream so you can remember these important things. You must never forget these things we have told you tonight. You must remember every time, each year, these songs and dances. You must paint with blood and feathers from Mandela, Gunabibi, and Jugu, and you must dance all the things we saw and named on our journey, which ran away into the well. after the men danced the new dances and ceremonies for the first time, they went back to their own country. And this is the final word from the informants that told Warner the story. We dance these things now because our ancestors learned them from the two Wawilak sisters. So I hope you'll agree that it's a stupendous myth. But it's just absolutely full of just beautiful, precise, elegant contradictions. And when they're live in the bigger workshop here, I sort of usually say to everybody, well, what's the most striking, massive contradiction in the whole story? It may not quite work with Zoom asking a question, so I'll let anybody that's sort of got an idea perhaps say something. I'm being told here that my internet connection is unstable. I hope that's not too true. What's just the most critical contradiction of all? The thing that's just sort of just utterly baffling. It's probably not fair. I mean, for me at any rate, I can say, go on, Kimberly, you've got your mouth half open. What's the most baffling contradiction?
Unmuted.
I can't hear you.
If you want a rainbow snake, to go away, the last thing you'd want to sing would be Yolngu and menstrual blood. You wouldn't do that. You want the rain to stop, you want the flood to stop, you want the snake to go away, then you would not sing about menstrual blood, because menstrual blood is causing the trouble in the first place.
Yes. And then there's something connected with that, isn't there? Which is the last part of the story. If all of this was a terrible calamity, an absolute catastrophe for these poor sisters who got swallowed alive by a cannibalistic, bloodthirsty snake.
Incestuous.
And incestuous, exactly, incestuous, as well as, yes, I mean, eating your own flesh is kind of cannibalism, incest, all sorts of things, of course. But if the lesson is don't do this, be warned, be careful not to menstruate anywhere near a waterhole, especially not two of you together, mixing childbirth blood with menstrual blood. If the lesson of the myth is don't, be very careful not to pollute a waterhole, and then go through all these things. I mean, if everything those sisters did led to absolute catastrophe, why is it that men take such great pains to repeat precisely everything those sisters did? I mean, if it's disastrous, why go out of your way, taking great pains to make all those mistakes, to do everything wrong way, to do the opposite of what you would need to do to keep safe? So what can possibly be
in the chat, Mary is pointing out they look like men with their stone spears. What, why do they have to look like men? Contradictory.
Yes, well, I mean that's another huge paradox, except when we know there's something there's a lot of interference. Shall I can
mute and then people can unmute. Mute everyone.
Yeah, I need to mute, I think.
Mute everybody and then they can unmute.
Okay. So, I mean, yes, there are many contradictions, but I think I'm going to stick with this one, which is if everything was so wrong, why repeat the wrong? It doesn't seem to make sense of sight. There's no doubt about when men go through their initiation rituals, they make every effort to meticulously repeat every action taken by the two Wawilak sisters. So,
Andy has his hand up. Do you want to ask a question, Andy?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. All right, Andy.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for this, Chris. It's been absolutely brilliant. I think this isn't in a patronising way. You missed your way. You could have been on Jack and Ori. and you know, all kind of storytelling and stuff for the BBC. The way you delivered that was absolutely excellent. But one of the questions which I want to ask is from kind of a perspective of a snake or the dragon, you know, the earth, you know, the sky, fire, water, and all that kind of stuff. Is there any kind of anthropological perspectives on this from kind of a queer kind of perspective? You know, 'cause it's all about like transition and things like that. Is there anybody who's actually doing that at the moment? Just out of interest.
Well, as I said earlier, I mean, it's a good question. So we have the dragon in all these fairy tales, and of course we have the dragon in China, in Japan, in Korea, or in the East. You know, we have, and of course there, the dragon is very similar. It's still a snake with wings. It's got all those, you know, those contradictory aspects. But what does it mean? It means sovereignty. It kind of means divinity, sovereignty, sovereign power. You can't be an emperor without being the emperor of China in the past, in the name of the dragon. So here we have the dragon. We have the rainbow snake, rather. And I think in answer to your question, in Aboriginal Australia, until the missionaries got, you know, I mean, mostly put an end to, not entirely, but put an end to quite a lot of the initiation rituals. And of course, missionaries don't like the snake because it looks a little bit like maybe the devil. And of course, missionaries have all these views about good and evil, which, you know, have nothing to do with indigenous culture. But the point I'm making, to answer your question, is that yes, until the 30s and 40s and 50s, but not too much after then, this myth was acted out in very great conscientious detail in ritual. And the argument I'm making is that all the world's magical myths and fairy tales are scientific in the sense that they are accurate maps to the experiences of initiation. And in initiation, you're a girl or a boy, you come of age, and you go through death. You go through all the experiences, the psychological terror and experiences of dying, but you come out of it, you come back alive again. So I don't know how much that helps, but I mean, the point I'm making, you're asking if it's practiced. I mean, much less these days than and one of the reasons why this particular version of the story is the one I prefer is because Europeans didn't like going up to that part of Australia. It's monsoon, lots of mosquitoes. The climate it's not like Sydney and places. You know, so it was among the last places for the missionaries and the colonists, the settlers to turn up in. So so this version is very very authentic and was told to the anthropologists by people who are still able to be proud of their culture, not make apologies, not hide things, not hide, for example, the menstrual blood and stuff, which, you know, missionaries can't stand all these things, and not just missionaries.
I heard Andy talking about get an aspect of homoerotic or gay sex.
Okay.
Is that right, Andy?
No, not necessarily. But I'm kind of looking at, like I said, because the missionaries and stuff like that would have had it through a certain perspective, you know, viewing this through a certain lens. But kind of a lot of the detail, it might have been lost or whatever to myself. But I'm looking at, has this ever been looked upon from, you know, a kind of queer perspective, in a sense, you know, in a sense that, you know, you've got the transition, you've got, you know, two kind of opposite forces, but then, you know, what kind of brought it to mind was when you was talking about that, you know, it doesn't look like it's going to be a penis, but it might be a womb or something which of collaborates
Andy,
a little bit, you know, that.
Yes, Andy, I can answer your question. It's a good one. So, I mean, Camilla's written a lot about this, the origins of gender. When girls go into initiation ritual, when they're initiated, they kind of turn into boys. When boys go through initiation, they turn into girls. So the period of what I call sex drive, the period of ritual power, is a period during which sort of masculine versus feminine, all that sort of gender stereotype that we are so fond of in the West, all that gets dissolved, and women are like men, but also, of course, humans are like animals. So that's what I was talking about, the first creation. And the first creation, you don't get these, you don't have to be a man or a woman, you don't have to be a human or an animal, you don't even have to be alive or dead. You're kind of all of those things at once. That's kind of normal as an initial state during an initiation ritual, and therefore it's the initial state during during the myth. But if you just let me, please, I want to, I mean, I hope we're going to have time for a kind of wide-ranging discussion, but I want to explore what I was just talking about before. Why would, which seems to be the central puzzle, why, if everything's wrong, if it leads you to being swallowed alive by a snake, why would men to this day feel it's so important to do those wrong things meticulously? That's the thing. So, okay, now, what we need to know is that being inside a rainbow snake is the way I would put it, really, because I was brought up a Roman Catholic. It's something like being inside the blood of Jesus. In other words, it's the most intense form of communion. I'm pretty much an atheist these days, although I've still got elements of some kind of faith, which is being challenged a bit as well, even political faith. But what I know is that the world's religions, all the world's great religions, kind of come out of the kind of religion we humans began with, and this myth is very close to that earliest of all the world's religions. And being in a community, religious community, means being sharing in the blood. And according to the Christian doctrine, Jesus at the Last Supper said, "This is my body, this is my blood, and if you drink my blood and eat my body, you will not die. You will live forever." And so, as a Catholic, I used to go to church and eat Jesus's flesh. As Catholics, we didn't quite drink the blood. The priest did that, but I know that drinking the blood is another critical part of it all. But the critical thing is that when you do that, when you celebrate the Mass, you enter into the body of Christ. You all become one body. And just in terms of queer theory, I mean, just as an aside, really, it doesn't matter a damn whether you're masculine, feminine, orientation. You're somewhere else. You're kind of free of all that. But of course, you come back once you come out of the church, go to this world once again. Now, Warner was told by his informants the meaning of sharing the blood. Now, what happens is that the men in this part of Australia, actually nearly all of Australia, men would menstruate. It's quite difficult for a man to menstruate, for a biological male to menstruate, but with a knife, or some sharp object, you can cut your ear, you can hit your nose on a plank of wood, you can cut your tongue, you can cut your arm, you can cut your penis. I mean, it is possible to bleed. And then, of course, if you're in a community, you can construct the idea that in bleeding, you're doing what women do, but perhaps doing it better because you're men instead of the women. So what happens is on the day before the ritual reenactment of the. So on the day before the circumcision, a bloodletting ceremony takes place in the old men's camp. The blood is to be used as an adhesive to hold the birds down and native cotton to the dancers' bodies. Before a man offers his blood for the first time, Yolngu, which is this trumpet, is blown over his body. Then the old men sing over him. Meanwhile, his arms are tied near the wrist and shouldered with a stout cord. A stone spearhead, just like the one the women were carrying in the story, a stone head is broken and a flake of it used to make a half-inch cut in the lower arm. The leader rubs the man's head with his hand while another cuts his arm. The totemic emblem is blown against the wound. The blood runs slowly. This is a quote from Warner's ethnography. The blood runs slowly and the rhythm of the song is conducted with equal slowness. In a second or two, the blood spurts and runs in a rapid stream. The beat of the song sung by the old men increases to follow the rhythm of the blood. The blood runs into a paper bark basin. So can you see what's happening? There's a pulse of the blood as it spurts out. The song has a beat and it echoes and synchronizes with the beat of the pulse itself. The next man opens a hole from yesterday's giving and the blood pours forth into a stream. It runs quickly and the rhythm of the song is at a fast tempo. There is much smiling among the men and an occasional mind milk, good. They're all having to encourage each other really intimately, holding each other, fondling each other, helping the blood come out. The third man pulls off an old scab from his arm and the blood pours forth in a larger stream than that of the others. The trumpet continues to blow. Several men proudly exhibit their arms, which show 5 and 6 cuts that have been made during previous ceremonies. Now, the critical point. An informant explains the meaning of this sharing of blood. And this is an Aboriginal elder explaining it. The meaning is like this. Suppose you and I have come a long way and we reach a good camp and our people have one house empty and it is a good place for us and they take us in and put us in it. We get in that house and have a good sleep and no one can hurt us because we have friends. That blood is just like that. It makes us feel easy and comfortable, and it makes us strong. It makes us good. So when you're swallowed by the snake, you're back home. You're with your comrades, with your sisters, with your brothers, with your blood. You're safe, you're secure. No one can harm you. That's what it feels like to be inside the snake. But then if you accept that, why then in this story are the sisters depicted as doing everything wrong, trying to sing songs to stop the rain, stop everything, stop being swallowed by a snake? What is it? And why do you have this image of the sisters? I don't know, as Camilla said, that everything you shouldn't do, they seem to be doing. Well, what we've got to understand is gender politics. In Australia, these days, right up until quite recently, and no one quite knows how far back into the past, but I'm pretty certain before the settlers arrived, many parts of Australia were pretty patriarchal. Male dominance had pretty much established itself. Not everywhere, and still women's made huge fightbacks against it, particularly in the western part of Arnhem Land. It was like a tussle. In Western Arnhem, the women have their snake, the men have their snake. There's a kind of to and fro pendulum of power, really, rather like what Mona Finnegan has described as going on in parts of hunter-gatherer Africa, where women take the power and then men take the power. But mostly men across Australia, in recent times at any rate, have got the overwhelming weight of ritual power. Now, once men start to menstruate and give birth, how do men give birth? Well, they take children from the women, they put them in a big hole, a big sort of collective womb. They pour their menstrual blood from their arms or maybe from their penis in Central Australia over the boys. The boys are kind of put back into the womb of the great mother. Their real mothers can't see them for a while. And then eventually the boys are given back to the mothers, reborn from death, having been swallowed by the snake. But once men are doing that, once men are gaining ritual potency, gaining this intimate solidarity through menstruating and giving birth, can you see that kind of men's menstruation as against the real thing, does it, it kind of doesn't compete. So for men to be able to get away with synchronizing their, I would say, fake menstrual blood. I mean, fake's perhaps too harsh a word. I don't know, depends kind of what your gender politics is, but I don't think, my own view is that men can't menstruate, but they can put on a great show of it. I have another view, which is that the biological male can't really give birth or get pregnant. I mean, I'm just talking about a biologist now, not talking about gender identity, I'm talking about biology. But what men do in Australia, but at women's expense, is synchronize the menstruation, make a big ceremony of it, and synchronize the childbirth, making a big ceremony of that as well. So if you like, the symbolic potency of menstruation and childbirth is taken from women and monopolized by men. So now, I mean, you might think I've come up with some kind of theory about male menstruation, and I do meet people who say, "Oh, Chris, you've got a theory that men, when they cut themselves in circumcision in Australia." It's an interesting theory, but it's not really likely, is it? Well, it's just, the point is that as soon as you listen to the Aboriginal elders, I mean, take Warner, they say it themselves. Of course, these are secrets. These are male secrets kept as secret at the expense of the opposite sex. And Warner published them in a book which would be read by Europeans. This book of Black Civilization, which is luckily he did, because of course otherwise all this magnificent culture would have been largely lost thanks to the missionaries and people. But let me just put it this way. I just talked about being inside the snake. So we have it being coated by an envelope of blood, joined together in that way, you become a snake, which is why that very short early version of the story, which I read out, that was used by Cecilia Vicuña, the Chilean artist, she said 2 women got together, opened their legs, faced each other, synchronized their periods, made a loop of their, made string out of their blood, put a loop around them and got swallowed. It's clearly they wanted to be swallowed by a rainbow snake. It's quite easy for women. They just need to menstruate together. I mean, that's not that easy. You've got to do got to know the kind of ritual practices to conduct in order to get this potential for synchrony into reality. But clearly, women were doing it on purpose. But what we always find is that the snake is defined as kin, which means own blood. And if we're trying to explain why is it that the myth makes this brotherly care for his 2 sisters, bringing them into the solidarity and security of the snake into something terrible, well, it's because the male Aborigines with their cult want to scare away the women from synchronizing their menstrual periods and deriving symbolic power from menstruation or childbirth. Because if the women started doing these things, they would do it so much more convincingly than the men can do. And so the men's version of it all would be challenged. I mean, an analogy I make is with Christianity. If you ask why were women not allowed to be priests, why were menstruating women not to be allowed in church at all? Well, think of Jesus's blood. It was very important for the largely patriarchal theologians and clerics to make sure that there was no competition experienced by the blood of Jesus. His blood had to be, had to save, and women's blood had to be kind of kept right out of it, because otherwise it would be challenged. But anyway, the point I'm making is that whereas the mythological sisters in this story are alleged to have been afraid of the impending disaster of being swallowed, the real secret is that men kind of know, because they imitate the women, they know that the women must have been wanting to do this, because that's why the men are so anxious to be given, either in a dream or in some other incident at the end of these stories. They want to get from the women the secret of how to do this. So here we have the native interpretation. Here's an informant, his own words. The blood that runs from an incision and with which the dancers paint themselves is something more than a man's blood. It is the menses of the old Wawilak women. Old there means ancestral. So when a man cuts himself and bleeds, that is the menstrual blood of those 2 Wawilak sisters. Oh, again, Warner was told during a ceremony, that blood we put all over those men is all the same as the blood that came from the sisters' vaginas. It isn't the blood of those men anymore, because it has been sung over and made strong. And again, as I remember, you have wine, but it needs to be sung over to make it into the blood of Jesus. I kind of believed it. I found it hard to believe, but I kind of did it. And of course, that's the ultimate secret of the Catholic Church. The Protestants were pretty feeble. They just said, "Oh, the blood symbolizes the blood of Jesus." But no, we Catholics, we're much more steadfast. No, it isn't just a symbol of the blood of Jesus. When you drink that blood, it is this transubstantiation. That's right. It is the blood of Jesus, not just a metaphor, not just a symbol. It really is Jesus' blood. So it isn't the blood of those men anymore, because it has been sung over and made strong. The hole in the man's arm isn't that hole anymore. It's all the same as the vagina of that old woman that had blood coming out of it. This is the blood that snake smelled when it was in the Miramina well. This is true for Junguan and Gunubibi. When a man has got blood on him, he's all the same as those 2 old women when they had blood. All the animals ran away and they couldn't cook them. And perhaps I'll just a few more things to say about all kinds of other issues, but I just want to get to the end. Here is the kind of summation of the meaning of all these myths and rituals. This is from another anthropologist, Ronald Berndt, but a little bit later than Warner, but in the same area. So we're the same people, the same Yolngu people, and he's talking to some men who, I mean, they know what they're talking about. And I just can't understand the arrogance of Western anthropologists and interpreters when they just think, oh, well, these are just silly stories. These men know what they're talking about. And the reason they know is because they have been doing it. And so what they know, and this secret, which is that the things they do have been kind of robbed from women, or at least taken from women. How do they know about this, which you might think is something about the distant mythological past? Well, no. They know they were robbing women of their menstrual potency and symbolic potency because they're still doing it. Because every time they have their rituals, by menstruating and giving birth, they are taking that potency from women by themselves being women. There's a real kind of robbery of women by initiated men taking place. So here's the quote. This is the men themselves saying, why don't we just listen? But really, says this informant, we've been stealing what belongs to them, the women. For it's mostly all women's business. And since it concerns them, it belongs to them. Men have nothing to do, really, except copulate. It belongs to the women. All that belonging to those Wawilak, the baby, the blood, the yellow dancing, all that as the women. But every time we have to trick them. Women can't see what men are doing, although it really is their own business, but we can see their side. This is because all that dreaming business came out of women. Everything, only men take picture for that Yolngu. By take picture, they may make a copy of the rainbow snake for them, like a copy of the menstrual blood, a copy of all the things that women do in the ritual. In the beginning, we had nothing because men had been doing nothing. We took these things from women. Again, I just think when people just say, oh, well, that's just a myth, it just seems, if you just think about it, is it likely that menstrual synchrony, synchronizing menstrual flows as a means of getting intimate and having ritual power, is it likely, on the face of it, that that was invented by men? You know, I just don't think so. Of course, you know, there's all kinds of other arguments, which is that women can't menstruate synchronously. It's not even possible biologically. Women don't synchronize their periods, blah, blah. Okay, but then the evidence in Australia is that they once did. All the evidence of mythology, of ritual, of, you know, it all suggests that not just they once did, but that the foundation of religion and culture was the ability to synchronize menstrual cycles with the moon, and through using the moon as your clock, synchronizing with each other across the landscape. Now, my argument, of course, and it's really no different from the argument of other serious anthropologists who've done ethnography and got informants from, you know, from that to inform them. For example, there's a marvelous anthropologist called Kenneth Maddock. He says the secret of the snake, it's a certain logic. It's not a thing, it's not an object, it's not this kind of species of snake or that kind of snake, it's not a penis, it's not a vagina. He said it's cyclicity. But remember what he means by cyclicity. He means the cyclicity of the moon as it waxes and wanes, or the seasons as they go from wet to dry, all the movements from life to death. The whole landscape is kind of cyclical if humans initially became human by establishing once a month some things are sacred, namely our bodies. It's dark moon, our blood makes us sacred, and then moving from dark moon to full moon. Imagine an entire landscape where the moon has that influence, where you have a sort of to and fro, a rhythm, where one moment, one phase of the moon, everyone's brother and sister, nobody's husband and wife, but at full moon, everyone is released from that spell, if you like, from that magical spell of the blood, and now you have a completely different phase of 2 weeks when marital sex can be enjoyed, but only for 2 weeks before everyone goes back to, all the husbands become brothers again, all the wives become sisters again, to and fro between opposite worlds. Imagine that rhythm. It's like you're going between life and death, heaven and earth, male and female, human and animal. Put all that together, you've got the dragon. And the reason why the dragon is such a universal motif is because actually we all come from there. That's how we became human. We had a pulse. All living things, to be alive, to prove that you're alive, there needs to be a pulse. If you're stuck in one phase, you've lost it. You've lost the pulse. if you have light but no darkness, if you have good without evil, I mean, I'm obviously the whole idea of good and evil is a complete nonsense, because you need the darkness as well as the light. You need the wings of the snake as well as its body. These traditional cultures and rhythms and myths just didn't have good up here with light and evil down here with darkness. All that vertical stuff just wasn't part of it. Instead of what you had, and this included gender identity as well, you didn't have to be stuck as male or female, stuck as masculine or feminine, even stuck as human rather than animal, or even stuck as alive rather than dead. You had this wonderful freedom to move between animal and human, life, heaven and earth, with the changing phases of the moon. And that was a magical freedom, which we still sort of remember in our fairy tales, but we've demonized it. Patriarchy doesn't want to go there. And so this magical snake with wings, in the West anyway, particularly became demonized as this evil dragon that's hungry for maidens. The reason why the dragon wanted maidens is because the dragon was made out of maidens. You can't be a dragon without connecting up women's blood. So of course the dragon needed maidens. It needed water, it needed maidens, particularly maidens coming of age and having their first menstrual ritual. But this snaky thing, the best way to picture egalitarianism, a chain of people in a line, like a picket line actually, without a head and a tail, without a head up here and a tail down there, is precisely a snake. A snake is a beautiful metaphor for something like the solidarity of standing together in resistance against something. In this case, of course, with humans, it was in resistance against male sexual abuse, male dominance, but it was kind of periodic. So the women had a turn, the men had a turn, and everyone had a chance to be kind of everything, but not for too long. Don't outstay your welcome. But take turns. It's what Mona Finnegan, working with African hunter-gatherers, egalitarian hunter-gatherers, called communism in motion. Communism, some of us think in those terms. There was once a time when we were communists, at least in the sense we weren't capitalists, we didn't have private property. But what Mona's pointing out, which is absolutely right, communism was never a state. It was never something fixed. It was a phase of communitas, a phase of something like communism, but also you'd escape from that and be completely free individuals again, but not for too long, because that can go pear-shaped too. So you just move between those poles. And that was genuine freedom. It's actually something like what we need today. And really what would be good would be to get back into being a real dragon around the world. That's it.
Right. Fantastic, Chris. Amazing story. It cast quite a spell. And are there comments or thoughts or questions? Anybody'd like to jump in with anything?
This is probably a silly question, but I was thinking about circumcision and cutting, and in how you describe, I should probably know this, so please do forgive me for my ignorance here, but so the sisters, there's a part I think that you said, Chris, where they are cutting, the women actually are cutting, and I'm wondering whether that's so the men are justified later because they follow the details so much that you say they follow every disastrous detail that the women do. So in order for them to take the power, they're following the cutting of the women, and in order so they can actually menstruate. So, and I don't know where I read this, I don't know if you know this, Camilla, or if I'm just making it up. Has the women cut in any of their ceremonies? Do they practice any of this cutting on themselves? That was just what I was thinking about.
Can I start the answer by saying, no, it's not in the myth. The women don't cut. They certainly don't cut themselves.
The Wawilak sisters are saying they're going to circumcise their sons.
Their sons, oh, I see, yeah.
They were going to cut their sons. They never got round to it because kind of the equivalent of cutting their sons, the equivalent of a male initiation ritual now happened, but of course happened to the women. So
yes, yeah.
Their sons didn't get, I mean, they didn't need to cut the sons because all the blood you needed was coming out of them and turning into the great, blood streak flood. So
they are.
yeah. So
in response to it's Hadza, in response to that, there is some cutting by Hadza women in their rituals, yes.
Okay, yeah.
But it takes different types of forms, so we can, another time we might talk about this.
Yeah.
But,
can we not talk about the Hadza today, and because simply because we need a bit of focus, and it's so much happening here with the Australian stuff. Yeah. Anybody got anything to add?
It's Dasha and then Ian.
Okay.
I had to leave for a meeting because of the time change thing. You guys haven't changed the time yet, and I had a meeting for the last 45 minutes, unfortunately. So maybe you've talked about this already, but I'm curious about, turn my volume up. I'm curious about how the Australian Aborigines became so patriarchal, so extremely patriarchal, and whether the story has something to do with the rationale, or I don't know. Can you say something about what how you interpret that? Thank you.
Yes, certainly. There's one part of Australia, Western Arnhem Land, where Catherine Byrne, the wife of Ronald Byrne, did field work. And the women have a huge amount of power, massive sexual liberation, sexual freedom. They have rituals without any bloodletting, none of that at all, no male menstruation. And women during their rituals exercise their traditional right to choose a husband to whom they're sort of already married in a sort of technical sense, because everyone's married through the section and subsection system already. I mean, there's kind of what it means is that these, from the point of view of these women, those men over there are potential husbands. You're sort of already married to them, but of course, whether you have sex with them is up to you. Do you have the opportunity? But what Catherine Birch points out is that the moment those women get the opportunity, because they've all come together in a ritual, it's actually the women who are by far the most aggressive and assertive in just grabbing men and going off with them into the bush and having sex. And the men get pretty exhausted fairly quickly, but the women can go through the night having 6, 7, 8, 10, a dozen lovers, and take and make sure they do. So, I mean, and again, I mean, obviously Christians and missionaries and Westerners in general, I suppose, because we all come from versions of, most of us, either Jewish or Christian or whatever, but Islamic cultures, we might find all that really shocking. But I mean, of course, that is what happens. And I can't think of any more definitive sign of women's freedom and liberation than when it involves sex, when women can just, and by the way, the men in Western Arnhem Land, they do get a bit jealous, but it's laughed at. I mean, they're being silly. Don't get jealous. And in fact, sometimes the men try to sort of cope with their potential jealousy by encouraging the women to go off and have sex with in this thing. I mean, one of them is called a Jamalak ceremony, which is kind of, before you have a more serious ceremony, everyone has as much sex as they can in order to sort of create an atmosphere of trust and bonding. Okay, now the question is why, and it's to do with resources. So, it's just so simple in my own view. If the resources are such that the women can gather in large groups and they can all stick together, I mean, this is a very, very rich ecology across the whole northern Australia, Arnhem Land places. There's fish, waterfowl, eggs, all kinds of bulbs, lily bulbs and stuff. Never mind, never mind all the game animals, which would also be, in that area. So, the subsistence wasn't a matter of having to scrape around for scraps of food, dispersing very widely, looking for tubers. Now, in Central Australia, Western Australia, and places, women just had to disperse. And when you disperse, you just don't have your solidarity. So it's during periods of abundance, when there's enough food to go around, and even in Western Arnhem Land, there would only be certain seasons when that was possible. But in the season of plenty, just before the monsoons break, everyone would in this part of the world would assemble together. And in Western Arnhem Land, the women had a very considerable amount of ritual power. And what I was describing here in this, as a result of this story, the ritual enactment of this story, as the men, doing their stuff and kind of robbing women of their symbolic power, In Western Arnhem Land, that really doesn't happen. And even in East Arnhem Land, where this story comes from, it's not quite the way Warner describes it. When Ronald and Catherine Byrne described the same rituals, they noticed that this critical thing, in the most sacred, secret part of the ritual, when the women are supposed to be most kept away from the secrets, guess what happens? The women dress up, paint their bodies in ochre and oil, thrust themselves forward in a sexually provocative way and invade the men's sacred ground, capturing for themselves the rainbow snake, who under women's control is not called Yolngu, who's called Kichin. And so the women take power, then the men take power, then the women take power, and you have this pendulum of power, which in my own view was the original system. But where that breaks down, and you're quite right, that Tasha, that in many parts of Australia, the patriarchy, the male dominance is very extreme. It's just because there's no subsistence basis for women's foraging together and therefore forming enduring alliances together. They're too dispersed, and then it takes the men to kind of move around and create. What the men do, they create these transspatial bonds by very painful forms of initiation, including subincision, which means, of course, opening up the underside of the penis and bleeding that way. Once young men have gone through that ritual, it's a costly signal of commitment. You don't do that and then just sort of change your mind about who you're committed to. It's extremely costly, and it means that the men now are committed to each other across the landscape in a way which women can't manage.
It's worth just mentioning the aspect of generational control as well, that gerontocracy, with the older men being able to control younger men, particularly because they can control like marriage and whether those younger men can get sex. So that it's not just simple patriarchy, simple men above women. It's older men really who are.
Yes, and of course the older women as well.
Older women as well may
also collude with and participate in arranging who's going to have sex with who and all that stuff. So there's quite a complex hierarchical structure of women as well as men, but with men overall mostly dominant. But I definitely don't want to give the impression that somehow this kind of male dominance is sort of it's sort of traditional, because it's emerged relatively recently, and who knows, there may have been areas of Australia long thousands of years ago when you've got quite substantial degrees of male dominance. But but the idea that that's kind of the way things are and always were is emphatically wrong. You could never have got to what we find here, with men needing to menstruate in order to prove their potency. So the fact that men need to menstruate in order to exercise ritual power and sovereignty is just showing how empowering it is to be able to menstruate, provided you can do it in a way which synchronizes you. And there's one more thing I just want to say. What these men, when they do monopolize ritual power, what they want women to be most afraid of, just think what it is. They want women to be most afraid of the rainbow snake. They want women to be most afraid of their own power. Women must fear their own potential through the moon, through the cycles, to connect up. That's what women are made to fear. It's not some external thing. It's an internal thing. Women are constructed to fear being powerful. Ian.
Yeah, it's there's a question asked by Mary about on the chat. Why did the Wawilak sisters have to look like men, like with the stone spears and the down and the blood? And I was thinking that you need to address that in a way that maybe has to step outside of the myth, which is so much to do with politics, in terms of the model we've been using in terms of wrong sex, wrong species, wrong time, as the sort of template for why opposition is and reversal is informing everything you've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, let me just try and do that. Obviously, it's a different lecture. This is a lecture about the origins of symbolic culture itself. But just for people who haven't been following back all these years, yes, Ian himself and Camilla and me in 1995, we had a sort of sudden flash of insight, which suddenly simplified everything. And it's like women needed at a certain point to make sure that men were helpful. The biological human male isn't always naturally helpful. Sometimes he just wants sex and then move on and leave his partner carrying the baby. And we know we were once apes, of course, and we still are kind of apes, and male chimpanzees aren't the slightest bit helpful. So the idea is simply that women needed to use their solidarity to make sure that men understood they weren't going to get any sex through violence or harassment and stuff. They were only going to get sex if they behaved by going out, using the violence against animals and bringing back the meat. So that meant that the females in coalitions had to find some convincing way of signaling no. Now that's a negative, that no, of course, no is intrinsically, by definition, a negative. But from the women's point of view, it was laughing, playful, fun, joyful, because it meant yes to their own, intimacy and solidarity. But how do you say no in a way which is intrinsically convincing? Well, there's no good whispering, no, not tonight, darling. I mean, no good using grammar or language. You've got to show with your bodies together that no means no, and that means reversing the bodily language signals, which mean yes. So a biological human male looking for fertile sex, he wants somebody of his own species, not some animal, different sex, not male normally, if he wants to get somebody pregnant anyway, and in a fertile period. So we worked out, okay, just reverse it. If for females to establish themselves as potent, they need to reverse sex, species, and time. And that means females acting out being male to dissuade the heterosexual male, acting out being an animal for the same reason, and acting out, or, menstruating as opposed to ovulating. And that gives you powerful females acting like men for the period. But actually, I mean, I think that's what Ian wants me to say. But it's important, of course, that in the rituals of initiation of girls across the world, as I know, particularly if you're familiar with all this, a girl during her first menstrual period, when she has her first menstruation, among others, she's shot her first zebra. So this idea of women acting like men and going hunting is what girls do to become women. And Camilla, as well as Ian, have written beautifully about all this. So I mean, look up anyone who's a bit puzzled by it all. So we have first creation, which is where you are during your initiation, and then you have second creation, which is when you go back to normality. Normality tends to be male versus female. You have one or the other identity and all that stuff. But while being initiated, while in the other world, if you like, while being beyond this world, women are going to be like men to be powerful, and also men are going to be like women to be powerful. So you have an image of a kind of sex which is, like maybe carnival is not a bad metaphor. Carnival, in some ways, no one's having real sex because everyone's having sex playfully in the streets. But you can experiment all the different ways of having a gender identity, gay, straight, all these different things in carnival. There's something like that's going on with humans as we first became human. We had not always, but the population would have disappeared if we hadn't had kind of ordinary sex. But we have a period of 2 weeks, waxing moon, carnival sex, if you like, not biological sex, when everyone can do all sorts of things, and then another 2 weeks after full moon, when people can get pregnant.
Any more questions? Probably a lot of people have been confused here. We've nearly reached 8:30, and I think that's probably as long as we should run. But is there any burning one other question?
There's one thing, because we've got somebody here, Tina, on cooking.
Yeah.
Let me just ask this simple question. I'll ask you in the audience. Please don't meander too far, because we've only got a small amount of time. Why did the animals run away and refuse to be cooked?
Sorry, are you asking me? Who? Asking anybody? Oh, asking anybody.
I mean, it's just one more paradox. What is it about those two sisters? So they tried to cook the animals they'd hunted, to put them on the fire, and they did a sort of reverse action thing, turning from dead to raw to human.
I think we need a whole more lecture on that, Chris. Yeah, go on.
Oh, all right.
Go on, Ian, quick.
Yeah, basically, if the sex strike is because there's no longer any meat in the camp, then it's obviously not only a sex strike, it's a cooking strike. There are no cooking fires. So it's that's why it's associated with hunger and raw food.
Yes.
So those two bleeding women cannot cook. It's just a matter of symbolic logic.
Yeah.
I'm sure Chris can say the final word on that.
Well, it's just that cooking means removing visible blood from meat. You imagine cooking. You've got a big earth oven. You put, I don't know, some huge animal in it. You put all the meat in the oven and you start cooking it. How do you know when it's cooked? You take a bit out and you look through it. Oh, if there's any visible blood in the meat, clearly it's got to go back in again because it's not cooked. Well, if cooking means removing blood from flesh, menstruating is completely the opposite. If you're bleeding while cooking, you're producing blood as opposed to getting rid of the blood. So you can't have the two together. All over the world, traditionally, when you're menstruating, you go into seclusion and you can eat stuff, but you certainly can't cook any meat, and you can't even
extremely cross-cultural wide taboos on cooking during menstruation. It's very, very widespread.
So these two sisters are depicted as
Wawilak myth may be the oldest story about that. One of the oldest ones, African stories also, but the Wawilak myth probably. I think we should just stress, Chris, because you were bringing in very interesting biblical analogies about the flood, that this story is massively older story about the flood than the Bible story. I mean, it is not a matter of this story copying Bible stories. It's absolutely not that. This story is quite independent, telling the story of the flood.
The Bible stories are, just a few bits and bobs of countless mythical fragments left over from the time when there's something like the Wawilak story was kind of pretty much worldwide in its variants, of course. So absolutely, Camilla, thanks for mentioning that, because the Bible story is a real newcomer, it's just little bits and bobs of memory of something like the Wawilak story. And again, perhaps everyone here isn't familiar with it. One of the things with Claude Lévi-Strauss, the great French structuralist anthropologist who made mythology, the study of mythology, into a science, his amazing discovery was that at the end of the day, all the world's magical myths are one myth only. We all speak a common language of mythology.
Like the snakes speaking their common language of ritual.
That's right.
I think we better bring this to an end. Can I edit? And I hope people have really enjoyed getting to grips with that incredible story. I mean, it is an extraordinary experience, that story. Just to say, we are on Zoom next week, but we are also back in the UCL class. So I do encourage anybody who can make it to London to the UCL Anthropology department, please come and join us. We will have a fantastic talk from Lucy Cook, the author of a brilliant book, Bitch, on the female of the species. It's looking at the whole array of female evolutionary strategies. Lucy's really a zoologist rather than an anthropologist, but it gives us an awful lot to think about in relation to human evolution as well. And it should be a really great session next week, whether you can make it on Zoom or whether you want to be there live. But otherwise, we should be saying goodbye tonight and have a good rest of the evening. And thank you very much to Chris for taking us through that, the Wawilak story. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, goodbye. See you next week.